Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that smells of damp straw and smoky hearths, where shadows dance along torchlit walls and a simple cough might send shivers down your spine. You're lying on a lumpy straw mattress, bundled beneath rough linen sheets, listening to the scratchy sound of rats scurrying beneath your floorboards, typical roommates in medieval Europe. But trust me, rodents are the least of your worries tonight, because we're diving into why getting sick in the Middle Ages was practically a death sentence, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with your location and what time it is right now. It always fascinates me to think about how we're connected through history and across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift uneasily on your mattress, the musty air prickling your nose as you consider the thin boundary separating medicine from magic in medieval times. The healer summoned to your bedside might be dressed in flowing robes embroidered with strange symbols, clutching herbs and crystals as often as actual medical instruments. You watch warily as they mumble cryptic chants in Latin, fingers tracing patterns through the air, hoping to coax the evil spirits from your fever-ridden body. Science isn't exactly booming these days, and your healer's credentials are probably something like, "My grandmother's neighbour taught me a spell last spring." In medieval Europe, medicine and superstition blend seamlessly. One day your village healer prescribes crushed garlic and honey sounds harmless enough, and the next they might suggest binding a dead frog around your neck to cure a sore throat. Sure, you might laugh, but who knows? Historians still argue whether some of these bizarre cures might have accidentally worked like mouldy bread, eventually leading to penicillin. But trust me, the frog necklace thing, not your best bet. Speaking of strange cures, there's one historical gem you'd wish to forget quickly, wearing the skin of a wolf to ward off diseases. Yeah, seriously, imagine explaining that to your neighbours. "Oh, this just my casual wolf pelt jacket. Totally normal. Nothing to see here." If anything, the fleas from that pelt would probably just add to your growing list of health issues. But let's be fair, it's not all about frogs and wolf pelts. Medieval healers also drew from ancient Greek and Roman texts, blending those classical medical theories with folklore and local traditions. The only trouble is that medical texts were often poorly translated and badly copied by monks, who frankly might have preferred illuminating manuscripts with elaborate illustrations than meticulously copying boring medical recipes. A pinch of misinformation here, a dash of mistaken herbs there, and your remedy might do more harm than good. Your local healer also relies heavily on astrology. Yep. The position of stars could literally determine whether you're cured or kicked off the mortal coil. Got a toothache? Maybe Mars is retrograde too bad. So sad. It's wild to think about how much trust people placed in astrological charts and planetary positions to predict illness and recovery. The healer checks their charts, furrows their brow, and mutters vaguely about Venus being in an unfortunate alignment. Not exactly reassuring bedside manner. And speaking of bedside manners, medieval treatments often involved rituals designed more to impress than to actually heal. Burning fragrant herbs to purify the air might provide some comfort after all. Anything's better than the smell of your unwashed bedding, but it's unlikely to tackle the disease eating away at you. Yet there's a weird charm about the theatricality of these rituals. The healer's whispered chants and carefully choreographed movements might give you a brief illusion of control over an uncontrollable situation. Sometimes these healing rituals even came with a hefty price tag. Healers, often travelling salesmen peddling dubious concoctions, could fleece desperate villagers of their few coins, promising miraculous recoveries. If you're unlucky enough, your family's entire savings vanish overnight in a desperate gamble to save you, and when your condition inevitably worsens, those healers shrug helplessly, mutter about evil spirits, and promptly vanish, leaving your family poorer and none the wiser. If all this isn't unsettling enough, consider that the line between healer and witch was frighteningly thin. One misstep may be an unusual herb mixture or overly enthusiastic chanting, and your healer could find themselves accused of witchcraft, quickly going from trusted village saviour to burning at the stake. If you're already nervous about your odds, knowing your healer might vanish overnight due to a witch hunt certainly doesn't help your fever-induced paranoia. And it wasn't just individual healers caught up in this messy blend of medicine and magic. Entire institutions of healing, such as monasteries, walked this tightrope. Monks cared of the sick, often genuinely attempting to soothe and cure through prayer, herbs, and simple comfort. But their knowledge was limited, and their techniques were hardly scientific. Yet, despite these shortcomings, monasteries were still often the safest places you could end up if illness struck you down. A cosy bed, steady meals, and basic hygiene went a long way, far more than many medieval peasants could hope for at home. As you lie in bed contemplating your odds, you realise how precarious your position really is. Whether you get treatment from a healer, a monk, or your neighbour's aunt who claims to know things, your chances are terrifyingly slim. It's a harsh reminder that, in medieval times, falling ill was less about fighting sickness and more about fighting blind luck, misguided beliefs, and, well, maybe not having to wear dead frogs around your neck. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your dimly lit room, keep in mind getting sick in medieval times isn't exactly a gamble you'd want to take. Tomorrow, if you wake up with even the slightest sniffle, you might find yourself wishing you'd paid more attention to the stars, or at least invested in a fashionable wolf pelt jacket. You step out onto the bustling streets of your medieval village, if streets is even the right word for these cramped dirt pathways that twist and wind through clusters of rickety houses. It's market day, and everything feels alive. Vendors shout above the chaotic noise, hawking their wares. Chickens squawk underfoot as children chase them, laughing. But beneath all that vibrant chaos lies something far less charming: the nauseating stench of garbage, human waste, and animals roaming freely, doing their business wherever they please. Welcome to urban sanitation, or more accurately, as to the disturbing lack of it. You hold your breath as you skirt around puddles of foul-smelling liquid, carefully avoiding the heaps of rotting garbage that pile up near every home. Medieval cities weren't exactly paragons of hygiene, and it's not uncommon for entire neighbourhoods to dump their trash directly into the street below. Historians still argue whether city planners even considered basic sanitation when expanding urban areas, but honestly, one look at your street and you can probably guess the answer. Here's the kicker: there's a drainage ditch at your feet, theoretically intended to channel away waste. But surprise, surprise, it's overflowing, clogged with mud, debris, and things you'd rather not inspect too closely. Rats scurry freely in broad daylight, feasting happily on the abundant filth. If you weren't already nervous about contracting something nasty, seeing rodents darting in and out of refuse piles might be enough to push you over the edge. Medieval urban life is often glamorized quaint cottages, charming market stalls, but the reality was far grittier and smellier than most people realize. Sewage systems? Haha, that's a future luxury at best. You might have a communal cesspit, a massive hole in the ground right in the centre of town. At worst, waste is thrown directly out of the windows, splashing unsuspecting passers-by below. Imagine casually strolling along, lost in thought, only to have your day abruptly ruined by a bucket full of someone's unfortunate leftovers. Talk about a rude awakening. If you're thinking you'd avoid these filthy streets by sticking to quieter neighbourhoods, think again. Back alleys are even worse. Narrow corridors where sunlight barely penetrates, air stagnant and thick with the stench of decay. These hidden paths are perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites, invisible foes waiting to invade your weakened immune system. Even a minor scrape from stumbling over a discarded pottery shard could escalate quickly. No antibiotics. Remember just a smear of questionable salve from your local apothecary, and maybe a whispered prayer. Now, before you start picturing medieval city dwellers as completely oblivious to hygiene, it wasn't entirely due to ignorance. Limited resources and a lack of infrastructure played huge roles. Fresh water is scarce in densely populated areas, and hauling clean water from wells located far outside town isn't exactly convenient. Washing regularly becomes a luxury reserved for the wealthy or those willing to trek miles just to bathe. So for most, cleanliness is more wishful thinking than daily reality. This neglect of basic sanitation inevitably turns cities into perfect incubators for disease. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever thrive in these conditions, lurking unseen in the contaminated water and food. One careless sip from a seemingly clear stream could land you in bed, delirious and dehydrated, fighting a losing battle against microbes you never even knew existed. And once illness strikes, it spreads quickly, leaping effortlessly from person to person in crowded marketplaces and cramped homes. But wait, medieval authorities must have taken some steps to combat this rampant filth. Right. Well, occasionally, yes. City officials sometimes passed laws attempting to curb sanitation disasters. For example, some towns required residents to sweep their doorsteps regularly. Great. Problem solved, except there was no real enforcement. Imagine trying to convince your neighbours, who've always tossed garbage into the street, that they suddenly needed to tidy up. You'd probably have more luck convincing a chicken to perform Shakespeare. Occasionally, towns attempted more ambitious solutions. London famously built public latrines on bridges, cleverly allowing waste to drop straight into the river below out of sight. Out of mind, at least for those upstream. Of course, for everyone living downstream. Things weren't exactly improving. You'd think someone might have raised concerns about this glaring oversight, but medieval folks had a habit of accepting inconveniences as inevitable. And speaking of rivers, they're often both lifesaver and silent killer. Sure, they supply water for cooking and washing clothes, but they're also the dumping grounds for tanneries, butcher shops, and yes, human waste. If you've ever wondered why waterborne diseases were so rampant, you need look no further than your friendly neighbourhood river. Fish swim sluggishly through murky waters, and villagers upstream send their problems downstream without a second thought. A delightful cycle of contamination, repeated endlessly. Ironically, Medieval people weren't completely blind to the dangers of uncleanliness, they just lacked effective solutions. Some wealthy individuals burned incense and fragrant herbs indoors, hoping to mask foul smells, believing bad odours carried diseases. It's actually somewhat insightful, given their limited scientific understanding, though burning lavender or rosemary didn't exactly solve the underlying sanitation problem. It's like spraying perfume over a pile of garbage, it masks the stench temporarily, but the garbage remains. Tonight, as you lie awake on your lumpy mattress, listening to the muffled sounds of the filthy city beyond your thin walls, you realise how dangerously vulnerable your health is. Your daily routine, navigating trash-laden streets and dodging mystery fluids, is more hazardous than any medieval villain lurking in the shadows. One misstep, one tiny cut exposed to this toxic environment, and you're spiralling into illness. In medieval times, urban life isn't just messy, it's deadly. So tomorrow morning, as you gingerly tiptoe through the garbage-strewn streets, holding your breath and praying no surprises fall from the windows above, remember that cleanliness might be next to godliness, but in medieval Europe, it's mostly next to impossible. As dawn creeps through your cracked shutters, you wake to an ominous ache in your chest, a soreness in your throat, nothing too alarming in your modern life. But here, in medieval Europe, even minor discomfort sends shivers of anxiety through your body. Reluctantly, you decide it's time to visit the local physician, and if you're imagining a friendly, competent professional in a white coat, you might want to adjust your expectations drastically. You walk through town toward the physician's modest workshop, passing villagers who eye you warily, probably thinking you've already become a walking plague carrier. Fear spreads almost as fast as sickness here, and the neighbourhood gossips are already whispering, speculating about whether your condition involves evil spirits, witchcraft, or just plain bad luck. Entering the healer's tiny room feels like stepping into a medieval curiosity shop, complete with jars of herbs, dried animal parts dangling ominously from rafters, and strange alchemical charts pinned to the walls. The physician stands by a table cluttered with mysterious tools, bronze instruments, glass vials, and a mortar and pestle smeared with something suspiciously green. Your healer greets you confidently, though you're immediately sceptical, mostly because he's about 17. Or maybe 70, it's genuinely hard to tell under that scruffy beard, and his medical credentials amount to vaguely recalling something his great-uncle mentioned years ago. In medieval Europe, doctors don't exactly attend prestigious medical schools or earn impressive diplomas. Instead, most learn their trade as apprentices to older healers, some knowledgeable, others dangerously clueless. So your healer's entire medical education might involve shadowing a mentor who firmly believes diseases are caused by invisible demons or by planets misaligning. Comforting, right. But let's not dismiss your physician entirely. After all, medieval doctors do sometimes study texts from ancient Greece or Rome, notably the works of Hippocrates or Galen. Unfortunately, these writings were translated into Latin by monks whose enthusiasm for accurate copying sometimes lagged far behind their zeal for elaborate illustrations. Imagine your healer puzzling over a faded manuscript, unsure if it recommends a spoonful of honey or oops, a spoonful of lead. As you nervously list your symptoms, the physician listens, occasionally nodding and mumbling thoughtfully, stroking his beard to lend an air of seriousness to the whole ordeal. After an uncomfortable silence, he finally announces, with unsettling confidence, that your illness is obviously caused by an imbalance of bodily humours. Of course, how did you not think of that humoral theory? The cornerstone of medieval medicine suggests your body contains 4 vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness occurs, your healer confidently explains, when these humours become unbalanced. For instance, your sore throat clearly means too much phlegm, while that pesky chest pain probably signifies excess blood. To restore harmony, your healer helpfully suggests bloodletting, or perhaps a gentle purge with questionable herbs. You're about to ask for alternatives, but before you can voice concerns, the physician gleefully brandishes a small, frighteningly sharp lancet. He seems disturbingly eager to drain some of your excess blood right here, right now. You try to smile politely, contemplating an escape route, but he already approaches, smiling warmly and promising you'll feel much better once you've lost a pint or 2 of that problematic excess blood. Historians still argue whether medieval healers genuinely believed bloodletting cured diseases or if it was just a profitable scam. Either way, your veins are about to pay the price. Desperate, you suggest alternatives, maybe some herbal tea, rest, prayer. Your healer sighs indulgently, clearly viewing your suggestions as the misguided ramblings of a frightened peasant. Still, he reluctantly shelves the lancet and begins mixing dried herbs, muttering cryptic Latin prayers as he crushes mysterious leaves into powder. You're not entirely reassured, but at least your veins remain intact for now. This uneasy balance between practical herbal remedies and questionable superstitions defines medieval medicine. Your physician might genuinely believe he's helping, mixing soothing chamomile or antiseptic thyme, but he's equally likely to include bizarre ingredients like powdered unicorn horn or snake flesh. Honestly, your health outcomes might depend less on medical expertise and more on sheer dumb luck, something you're not overly enthusiastic about gambling with today. Incredibly, medieval doctors sometimes stumbled onto effective treatments purely by accident. For example, willow bark tea, later discovered to contain aspirin-like compounds, could actually ease pain and inflammation. But your physician has no clue why this works. For him, it's simply another ingredient in his mystical toolkit. Sometimes, treatment succeeded despite the healer's profound ignorance, rather than because of their wisdom. On the other hand, your physician might advise remedies far less helpful and considerably more alarming. Ever heard of trepanation? Brace yourself. It involves drilling holes directly into the skull to release evil spirits or humoral imbalances, just another routine procedure in your healer's disturbing arsenal. Thankfully, your physician hasn't reached for his skull drilling tools just yet, but you eye them nervously, praying he doesn't get any sudden ideas. Of course, sometimes the best outcome you can hope for is your healer admitting he's out of his depth, at which point he'll advise consulting someone else, maybe a monastery healer, a wandering barber surgeon, or even the village wise woman, though consulting her risks accusations of witchcraft. So perhaps not. No matter your choice, it's clear your options for medical care aren't exactly inspiring confidence. Today, as you accept your healer's suspicious herbal mixture, you realize just how precarious your situation really is. Your life literally depends on the skills of a physician whose training comes from sketchy texts, dubious mentors, and astrology charts. If your illness doesn't kill you, your healer's good intentions, or more likely, his incompetence, just might. As you leave his cramped workshop, clutching your herbal remedy, you're struck by an uncomfortable realization in medieval Europe. Falling ill often means trusting your life to someone who barely understands the human body, let alone diseases. It's not comforting, but what choice do you have tonight? Lying awake beneath your coarse blankets, nursing your sore throat and chest pains. You hope your physician's latest guesswork is harmless, or at least harmless enough not to finish you off entirely. But deep down, you know better. After all, this is medieval medicine we're talking about. Your odds of survival are about as good as your physician's grasp on basic anatomy. You lie restless in bed, your room lit only by the faint glow of a dying candle, when suddenly a familiar face appears at your bedside, the overly enthusiastic physician from earlier, holding his favourite shiny lancet. Ah yes, bloodletting, the medieval cure, all that's ironically much more likely to kill you than the disease itself. He smiles reassuringly, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically for someone about to drain your life essence. Don't worry, he whispers gently. We'll have you feeling right as rain in no time. Great. What could possibly go wrong? Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, if your physician wants to sound impressively scholarly, is deeply rooted in the ancient humoral theory we talked about earlier. According to this wildly inaccurate medical tradition, illnesses are caused by imbalanced humours, especially too much blood. Convenient. Right. Your healer sincerely believes the best way to restore balance is by draining some excess blood, ideally before your blood pressure drops, or before your body figures out what's going on and desperately tries to compensate. You're probably wondering how exactly medieval healers decided when bloodletting was necessary. Did they conduct careful examinations? Maybe a thoughtful consideration of your symptoms? Nope. It's simpler and scarier than that. Many physicians used astrological charts to pinpoint the perfect time to let your blood flow. Venus aligned with Mars sounds like a good day to open your veins. Feeling particularly melancholy. Let's drain that bad blood out of your system. Basically, if your healer is in a good mood or just bored, you might end up a pint or two lighter. But here's the grim reality check. Medieval bloodletting was practiced everywhere, by everyone from village barbers to respected monastery healers, sometimes even enthusiastic amateurs. It's hard to exaggerate how pervasive this practice was. Even royalty weren't safe. King Charles II of England, centuries later, famously endured numerous bloodlettings before succumbing to kidney disease. Spoiler alert, it didn't help him. Your physician approaches closer, rolling up your sleeve with alarming confidence. You brace yourself as he expertly wraps a cloth tourniquet around your arm, making the veins bulge. He gently taps your skin with his fingers, seeking the perfect spot to strike. With a flourish more suited to theatrical performances than medical practice, he brandishes his lancet sharp, shining ominously in candlelight. You swallow nervously. After all, antiseptic practices aren't exactly a thing yet, and you really don't trust where that lancet's been. In medieval Europe, hygiene during bloodletting was, well, basically non-existent. Instruments were rarely sterilized, maybe wiped on a dirty cloth, if you were lucky. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for centuries, and infections ran rampant. Ironically, your minor ailment might be about to become seriously worse, thanks to your healer's eager lancet. Even tiny cuts introduced deadly bacteria, turning routine procedures into lethal gambles. One slip, one contaminated tool, and your healer might inadvertently transform a harmless headache into a life-threatening infection. But don't worry, your healer has other tools at his disposal if the lancet makes you squeamish. Ever heard of medicinal leeches? Yes, Those slimy little creatures, infamous for their blood-sucking prowess, were wildly popular medical assistants. Your physician might happily place half a dozen leeches on your skin, watching approvingly as they swell up, bloated with your excess blood, grossed out yet. You should be, though historians still debate whether medieval healers genuinely saw leeches as valuable tools or just as creepy accessories to their dramatic performances. If you survive the initial bloodletting session, already a pretty big if, the immediate aftermath isn't exactly comfortable. You're weak, dizzy, and nauseous. Ironically, your healer nods approvingly, convinced these symptoms indicate the treatment is working. It's not unlike praising someone for staggering after you've punched them in the face. See clearly, this is helping. For medieval healers, draining blood had an undeniable theatrical appeal, something dramatic to visibly demonstrate their skill. Patients who recovered likely attributed their improvement to this dramatic treatment, rather than simply their immune systems kicking in. And patients who worsened, well, obviously, they needed more bloodletting, better luck next time. Even more dangerously, medieval healers sometimes employed preventative bloodletting, bleeding perfectly healthy individuals to keep their humours balanced. Imagine your doctor today casually suggesting draining a litre of your blood every spring just in case. Medieval people embraced this terrifying routine enthusiastically, blissfully unaware of the harm they were causing themselves. But before you dismiss medieval bloodletting entirely as barbaric superstition, consider this intriguing fact: certain rare diseases actually respond positively to careful blood removal. Hemochromatosis, a condition involving excess iron in the blood, benefits from regular, controlled bloodletting. Of course, medieval healers didn't know this, accidentally helping a lucky few while harming many others. It's classic medieval medicine, sometimes accidentally right, usually catastrophically wrong. Tonight, lying weak and dizzy beneath rough linen sheets, you can't help but wonder how many of your neighbours' deaths were hastened by the very treatments meant to save them. How many minor colds turned fatal after overly enthusiastic bloodletting sessions. Sadly, medieval healers never learned from these mistakes, stubbornly clinging to their outdated theories, convinced they were saving lives even as their patients' bodies steadily weakened. As your physician finally leaves, carrying a basin of your blood and humming cheerfully, you contemplate your odds of surviving medieval healthcare. Spoiler alert again, not great. Your healer's enthusiasm for bloodletting might genuinely come from a desire to help, but intentions won't replace the blood you just lost. Tonight, you're weaker, paler, and more vulnerable than ever before. And tomorrow, well, assuming you survive this round, you'll likely be offered yet another bloodletting session to finish the job. In medieval Europe, falling sick often meant enduring treatments more dangerous than the diseases themselves. Your blood might flow freely, your strength ebbing away, but hey, at least your humours are balanced, right? Rest easy if you can. As you lie awake in the pale moonlight, your head swimming dizzily from your physician's recent enthusiasm for bloodletting, you ponder the curious reasoning behind medieval medicine balancing bodily humours. It sounds silly now, maybe even slightly humorous pun absolutely intended, but for centuries, this theory dominated medical thinking, guiding treatment decisions that were often tragically misguided. The humoral theory, originally dreamed up by ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, proposes that the human body is composed of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour is associated with specific characteristics and bodily functions. Blood is warm and moist, linked with optimism and sociability. Phlegm is cold and wet, associated with calmness and laziness. Yellow bile is hot and dry, responsible for anger and irritability. Black bile, cold and dry, was blamed for melancholy, depression, and anxiety. If you've ever wondered why medieval treatments seem so bizarrely specific, you can thank the humoral theory for those oddly precise diagnoses. Feeling anxious or sad? Obviously, you have too much black bile, nothing a good purge or a mixture of bitter herbs won't fix. Too cheerful? Clearly, you're overflowing with blood. Your medieval physician would respond by draining your veins or prescribing cooling herbs to temper your suspiciously enthusiastic disposition. In other words, any deviation from normal could quickly earn you an unpleasant intervention, often worse than the symptoms themselves. You might assume humoral theory was universally accepted without question, but interestingly, historians still debate how deeply ordinary medieval people actually believed in this theory. While physicians confidently lectured their patients about humours, everyday villagers might have nodded politely, secretly relying on simpler remedies handed down through generations like your grandmother's chicken soup or honey tea. Unfortunately for you, your physician is determinedly orthodox, fiercely loyal to his outdated textbooks, leaving you little choice but to endure his treatments. But humour balancing wasn't just theoretical, it had disturbingly tangible applications. Medieval doctors employed strict dietary guidelines to manage humours, advising patients on what foods to eat or avoid, based solely on their supposed humoral makeup. Feeling a bit sluggish today? Maybe you're phlegmatic and need to eat something hot and spicy to warm your body. Too energetic? A plate of cucumbers or lettuce, cold and damp foods might calm you down. Imagine going through life carefully balancing every meal according to dubious medieval nutritional advice, though given the general state of medieval cuisine, your choices were probably limited anyway. To make matters even more complicated, your humoral balance supposedly fluctuated seasonally. Physicians firmly believed the shifting seasons influenced your humours, urging people to adjust their diets accordingly. Spring, with its warm and moist air, stimulated an increase in blood, making people cheerful but dangerously excitable. Summer hot and dry meant yellow bile dominance, causing irritability and short tempers. Autumn, cold and dry, brought melancholy through excess black bile. Winter was predictably phlegmatic, dampening spirits with excess phlegm. If you found this all confusing, don't worry, medieval people probably did too. But confusion didn't stop them from following elaborate guidelines to manage these seasonal shifts. You'd change your diet throughout the year, diligently adjusting food intake to prevent dangerous humoral imbalances. If you failed to heed these instructions, well, your physician warned you might become hopelessly sick. Your humour's disastrously out of sync. Nothing like a bit of medical anxiety to spice up medieval meal times. Ironically, despite their shaky scientific foundations, humoral theories occasionally stumbled into accidental truths. Diet does impact health, just not exactly in the way medieval healers imagined. Eating fresh vegetables in spring or warm soups in winter makes sense for nutrition and comfort, even if your physician's logic was slightly flawed. And herbal remedies often prescribed based purely on humoral properties, sometimes genuinely eased symptoms through anti-inflammatory or antiseptic properties, entirely unknown to medieval healers. However, medieval medicine didn't stop at simple dietary adjustments. Some practitioners took humoral theory to alarmingly extreme levels. Ever heard of heroic purging? Trust me, you don't want to experience it firsthand. Medieval doctors sometimes prescribed powerful laxatives or vomit-inducing potions to aggressively restore humoral balance. Feeling slightly melancholy? Your healer might confidently prescribe a brutal round of vomiting to clear that pesky black bile. Sure, your mood might improve mostly because you're relieved it's finally over, but that's not even the worst of it. In their quest to balance humours, medieval physicians sometimes resorted to downright terrifying methods. One particularly disturbing practice involved cauterization, literally burning the skin with hot irons or caustic chemicals to eliminate excess humours. Imagine casually strolling into your healer's workshop complaining of mild anxiety and walking out with third-degree burns. No wonder medieval patients often hesitated to seek treatment sometimes. Enduring illness seemed safer than facing medieval medicine's alarming cures. Even diagnosing humour imbalance could involve questionable and frankly uncomfortable methods. Medieval healers carefully examined your bodily fluids, scrutinising urine or inspecting the colour and consistency of your phlegm. Yep, your healer might thoughtfully hold your vial of urine up to candlelight, solemnly declaring your humours dangerously out of balance based purely on appearance. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors had any genuine insights from these dubious examinations, or whether it was merely elaborate medical theatre designed to impress desperate patients. As you lie awake tonight, the discomfort of your recent bloodletting still fresh in your memory, you can't help but marvel at the strange logic behind medieval medicine. For centuries, the humoral theory guided treatments that range from mildly helpful to disastrously misguided. Medieval people, trapped in this world of dubious theories and brutal remedies, had no choice but to trust their healers, often paying dearly for that trust. You're painfully aware of how vulnerable you are in this medieval medical maze. Tomorrow, if your mood or symptoms shift even slightly, your healer might eagerly prescribe yet another alarming intervention. But for now, you close your eyes, hoping your humours, whatever that means, decide to remain balanced, if only for tonight. Sweet dreams, assuming your medieval physician doesn't interrupt them. Morning breaks reluctantly through your grimy shutters, and you wake up, still feeling drained from yesterday's disastrous attempts to balance your humours. As you stumble groggily toward your healer's workshop against your better judgment, you can't help but wonder what fresh horror awaits today. Turns out, it's a trip to your local medieval apothecary, a place that promises healing but more often than not delivers something closer to poison. You cautiously step into the dim, shadowy interior, immediately assaulted by a dizzying array of smells spicy, pungent, bitter, and strangely sweet all at once. Shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, packed tightly with mysterious jars, vials of strange liquids, dried herbs, powders, and disturbingly animal parts whose origins you'd rather not identify. It's a medieval pharmacy, but if you're picturing neat rows of clearly labelled medicines, think again. This is medieval Europe after all, and nothing is ever straightforward. Behind the cluttered counter stands the apothecary himself, a man of indeterminate age, wrapped in stained robes and squinting suspiciously through thick spectacles. He nods curtly at your arrival, barely concealing his annoyance at being disturbed from whatever dubious potion he's currently concocting. With a resigned sigh, you explain your symptoms: headache, fatigue, lingering soreness from your last bloodletting disaster. The apothecary strokes his scraggly beard thoughtfully before disappearing briefly into the shadows. When he emerges, he's holding a small vial filled with murky liquid. This, he confidently declares, should do the trick. You eye the vial warily, debating whether you're brave enough or desperate enough to actually drink whatever he's just offered. In medieval times, pharmacies or apothecaries were genuinely vital community institutions, selling herbal remedies and medicinal preparations to villagers who had nowhere else to turn. But here's the catch. Medieval pharmacists didn't exactly operate under strict safety regulations. Your apothecary might prescribe genuinely helpful herbs like chamomile or lavender, known even then for their soothing qualities. Unfortunately, he's just as likely to mix in mercury, arsenic, or lead ingredients now recognised as dangerously toxic, but back then considered totally acceptable medicine. Take mercury, for example, one of medieval Europe's favourite medicinal metals. Apothecaries cheerfully blended mercury into ointments, claiming it cured everything from skin rashes to melancholy. Of course, what it actually did was poison people slowly, causing hair loss, teeth falling out, and severe neurological damage. Historians still argue whether medieval pharmacists genuinely believed mercury cured diseases or just stubbornly stuck to outdated tradition. Either way, you might think twice before smearing this shiny metallic sludge onto your already battered body. Even stranger, and honestly, slightly terrifying are the animal-based remedies lining your apothecary shelves: crushed beetles, powdered snakeskin, dried scorpions, and even bits of mummified flesh imported from distant lands. Yep, actual powdered mummies were wildly popular medicinal ingredients, believed to cure everything from epilepsy to headaches. You're probably wondering how medieval healers justified consuming dried human remains. But let's be honest, if you're sick enough, even powdered mummy starts sounding vaguely reasonable. Perhaps your apothecary suggests a simpler remedy like drinking unicorn horn dust to counteract poisons and purify the blood. Unfortunately, medieval unicorn horn was actually ground up narwhal tusk, rhino horn, or even ordinary bone dust. Rich merchants eagerly paid fortunes for these supposed unicorn remedies, convinced they had magical healing properties. Spoiler alert, they didn't. But your apothecary isn't above selling you a tiny pinch of bone dust at outrageously inflated prices. After all, a desperate medieval patient is practically an ATM for dubious pharmacists. To his credit, your apothecary does stock genuine herbal medicines, some even effective. Willow bark tea helps headaches and fevers, containing compounds later known as aspirin. Garlic and honey mixtures possess antibacterial qualities. Even valerian root genuinely eases anxiety and insomnia. Yet, frustratingly, your apothecary has no idea why these treatments work. To him, they're simply another set of mystical ingredients in his vast and occasionally deadly collection. But perhaps the most dangerous thing about medieval apothecaries is their utterly unpredictable approach to dosage. Modern medicine stresses precise measurements to avoid overdosing patients. Medieval pharmacists had no such concerns. Your apothecary cheerfully hands you remedies with vague instructions like, take as much as feels right, or until you see improvement. If your potion contained deadly nightshade or foxglove, both occasionally prescribed by medieval healers, improvement might simply mean slipping quietly into unconsciousness. Your apothecary might reassure you by pointing proudly to his shelves stocked with expensive spices imported from distant lands: cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper. In medieval Europe, exotic spices weren't just culinary treats, they were medicinal marvels. Unfortunately, even these valuable spices could become dangerous in overly large doses. Medieval healers occasionally prescribed enormous quantities of nutmeg, unaware that it could trigger hallucinations, seizures, or even death. Imagine accidentally tripping on nutmeg, probably not how you imagine spending your medieval afternoon. As you linger in the apothecary's cluttered shop, inhaling scents of herbs and questionable animal products, you're acutely aware of the dangerous gamble you're about to take. You might emerge healed or poisoned. Your apothecary's casual confidence doesn't exactly inspire trust. And yet, what's the alternative returning to the enthusiastic bloodletting physician? At this point, powdered mummy honestly starts sounding reasonable. Tonight, as you carefully sip your dubious potion, grimacing at its bitter taste, you're struck by the absurdity and danger of medieval pharmacies. Behind rows of dusty jars lie substances capable of genuine healing or lethal harm. Your apothecary's well-meaning ignorance leaves your fate dangling precariously between recovery and disaster. As you lie back down, your stomach turning uncomfortably from whatever concoction you've just swallowed, you realise just how dangerous even the simplest medicinal decision can be in medieval Europe. One tiny vial could cure or kill, often leaving your outcome down to luck rather than skill. Sleep well tonight, and let's hope your apothecary guessed right. But given medieval medicine's track record, I wouldn't bet your life on it. You wake in the pre-dawn darkness, a chill creeping through your bones, and immediately you sense something is terribly wrong. Outside your window, the village bells are ringing frantically, a discordant, panicked sound echoing through empty streets. You pull yourself upright, heart racing, because you know exactly what that means. Plague has come knocking, and medieval Europe has no real defences against this invisible killer. Stepping hesitantly outside, you notice neighbours hurrying through the streets, their faces pale and anxious. The market square, usually bustling, is eerily deserted, stalls abandoned, doors locked tight. People dart furtively past, holding cloths to their noses, eyes wide with dread. The medieval plague, known ominously as the Black Death, moves swiftly, silently, leaving devastation in its wake. In medieval times, no one fully understood how plague spread, though modern historians now know fleas carried by rats were primarily responsible. But to your medieval neighbours, plague feels utterly random, mercilessly striking without rhyme or reason. Entire families might be wiped out overnight, while others somehow remain untouched, fueling wild theories and desperate superstitions about who is protected and who is doomed. Fear breeds superstition. Rumours whisper of dark omens preceding plague outbreaks, comets streaking ominously across night skies, unusual weather patterns, even sightings of strange animals. Medieval villagers grasp for explanations, any explanation, no matter how absurd. If you find yourself glancing suspiciously upward, wondering if last week's lunar eclipse somehow angered divine forces, don't feel too foolish. Your neighbours are doing exactly the same. Sadly, medieval medical knowledge offers little comfort. Physicians cling stubbornly to humoral theory, prescribing useless or even harmful treatments, more bloodletting, toxic herbal mixtures, pungent poultices. Villagers desperately burn aromatic herbs, believing fragrant smoke might drive plague away. Of course, this only makes breathing more difficult. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors genuinely believe such remedies worked, or if desperation drove them to attempt anything, no matter how futile. Some communities try quarantine measures, though these attempts are often tragically ineffective. Sick households might be boarded up, their residents forbidden to leave, town gates shut tight, isolating entire villages, trapping healthy and sick alike. Such quarantine might slow plague's spread, but it also dooms many inside, preventing any escape from contagion. If you're unlucky enough to find yourself behind these hastily erected barricades, your chances of survival plummet dramatically. As you walk slowly through deserted streets, you notice crosses hastily painted on doors of infected households, grim marks of doom, signalling neighbours to steer clear. Occasionally, you catch glimpses of masked plague doctors, haunting figures draped in long robes, faces hidden beneath eerie bird-beaked masks stuffed with herbs meant to filter out disease. Ironically, these costumes offer little actual protection except maybe scaring people into maintaining social distance. You might imagine plague outbreaks as sudden, intense events briefly devastating before disappearing. Unfortunately, medieval plague moves in relentless waves, lingering months or even years. Each outbreak leaves survivors permanently scarred, their lives forever shadowed by memories of loss and helplessness. Villages depopulated overnight struggle to rebuild, only for plague to return again, decade after decade. Life in medieval Europe feels like a perpetual waiting game, constantly bracing for the next deadly wave. If you're wealthy enough, perhaps you flee the city, retreating to isolated countryside estates until plague passes, but even that's no guarantee. Rats carrying plague-ridden fleas hitch rides in grain shipments, sneaking into homes unnoticed. Wealth might buy distance from crowded, filthy urban centres, but plague respects no social boundaries, mercilessly claiming rich and poor alike. If there's any comfort in plague's ruthless impartiality, it's that everyone shares this terrifying uncertainty equally. And speaking of uncertainty, medieval explanations for plague range from misguided to outright terrifying. Religious authorities insist plague signifies divine wrath, punishing humanity for sins real or imagined. Public penance rituals, processions of flagellants whipping themselves bloody to appease angry gods, sweep across Europe. Terrified villagers join desperately, hoping public displays of suffering might end plague's wrath. But instead, these gatherings only accelerate contagion, inadvertently spreading plague faster. Medieval Europe's desperate attempts to control plague ironically make matters worse tragically understandable, given their limited understanding of disease. Of course, not everyone resorts solely to religious explanations. Some villagers blame outsiders, strangers, minorities, especially Jewish communities, accusing them of deliberately poisoning wells. Horrifying persecutions erupt, innocent victims targeted by frenzied mobs desperate for anyone to blame. Medieval plague outbreaks trigger heartbreaking waves of fear-driven violence, turning neighbours against neighbours, further fracturing already devastated communities. Even medieval plague survivors suffer lasting scars. Chroniclers describe horrific symptoms, painful swellings called buboes, agonizing fevers, delirium. But survivors also endure permanent emotional trauma, haunted forever by visions of death, guilt over loved ones lost, and pervasive fear of plague's inevitable return. Living through medieval plague leaves deep psychological wounds, shaping entire generations with trauma and loss. Yet, incredibly, amidst overwhelming suffering, medieval people occasionally exhibit remarkable courage and compassion. Monks and nuns risk their lives tending the sick, offering comfort even when their efforts are doomed. Families shelter orphaned children. Neighbours share dwindling supplies, quietly defying plague's cruel isolation. While fear breeds cruelty and violence, plague also reveals humanity's stubborn resilience, shining brief, hopeful lights in medieval Europe's darkest moments. As you retreat to your tiny room, locking doors against unseen contagion, you realize plague represents medieval Europe's greatest fear, not just disease, but helplessness. Unable to understand plague's cause or spread, villagers cling desperately to rituals, superstitions, and dubious remedies. Medieval plague strips away illusion of control, forcing people to confront their vulnerability, often brutally. Tonight, lying anxiously beneath thin covers, heart racing at every distant cough echoing through empty streets, you understand why medieval plague inspired such profound dread. With no medical knowledge to protect you, no reliable cure to trust, your survival depends solely on chance, terrifyingly fragile odds in medieval Europe. Sleep if you can, but know, plague waits patiently just outside your locked door, indifferent, unstoppable, ready to claim anyone foolish enough to underestimate its silent, invisible threat. Sweet dreams, or rather, good luck. You lie restless in your narrow bed, chills creeping through you as your fever spikes. The dreaded plague hasn't claimed you yet, but your neighbours, in a final act of well-meaning desperation, have decided it's time you were moved somewhere safer, a medieval hospital. Unfortunately, in medieval Europe, hospitals aren't exactly places of healing. They're places people go expecting never to return home. With a sinking heart, you're transported through empty, eerie streets to a large stone building, its heavy doors looming ominously. Passing through the entrance, your senses are immediately assaulted. The air is thick and stagnant, mingling smells of unwashed bodies, sickness and mould. Rows of beds line cavernous halls, each filled with moaning, coughing, suffering patients whose conditions seem alarmingly worse than yours. Historically, medieval hospitals, often run by religious orders, weren't designed for recovery, but rather as places for the sick, poor to receive basic care, mostly prayers and comfort, before death inevitably claimed them. Far from pristine environments, medieval hospitals were breeding grounds for disease, infection spreading rapidly between patients crowded closely together in filthy conditions. You settle uneasily into your straw-filled mattress, painfully aware of your proximity to your suffering neighbours. Coughs echo through the hall, mingled with occasional whispered prayers. Any privacy is non-existent. Physicians and caregivers, mostly monks and nuns, move quietly between patients, offering simple comforts, a damp cloth, whispered prayers, sometimes a warm broth, rarely any genuine medical intervention. They're compassionate, genuinely trying to ease suffering, but hopelessly limited by medieval medical ignorance. Ironically, despite their good intentions, medieval hospitals inadvertently hastened death for many patients. Packed closely together, patients shared germs readily. Diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, and plague spread rapidly through overcrowded wards. Your weakened immune system, already compromised, is now exposed to countless invisible threats. Ironically, your chances of recovery might have been better if you'd stayed home, isolated. Even the simplest aspects of hygiene are severely lacking. Medieval hospitals lack proper sanitation facilities. Patients often forced to use shared chamber pots or worse, resulting in disgusting conditions ideal for bacterial growth. Washing linens, regularly now recognized as essential for infection control, was impractical. As hospitals struggled to provide even basic necessities like clean water, your bedding scratchy, thin, rarely washed becomes a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and disease. Yet medieval people viewed hospitals as vital community institutions, offering spiritual care and shelter to those without family or home. Hospitals often welcomed not just the sick, but beggars, pilgrims, and orphans, anyone desperate enough to accept shelter in these grim conditions. While admirable in theory, this open-door policy unintentionally created environments ripe for contagion. Historians still argue whether medieval hospitals genuinely helped patients or unintentionally harmed them further by exposing them to dangerous infections. But medieval hospitals weren't entirely without hope. Some, notably monasteries, managed gardens filled with medicinal herbs, genuinely helpful in easing symptoms, chamomile, lavender, thyme, all cultivated by monks who sincerely believed in the healing power of nature. While medieval caregivers didn't understand why certain herbs eased symptoms, they diligently administered teas and salves, sometimes providing genuine relief, even if unknowingly. Unfortunately, even helpful herbal remedies couldn't compensate for hospitals' fundamentally unhygienic conditions. Physicians still clung stubbornly to dangerous practices like bloodletting, eager to balance humours even as patients weakened. Surgeons, often self-trained barber surgeons, performed basic operations without anaesthesia or sterile tools, spreading infection from patient to patient. Medieval hospitals weren't sanctuaries of healing, they were dangerously misguided experiments in medical ignorance. Ironically, patients who recovered from minor illnesses sometimes left hospitals carrying new, more dangerous infections acquired during their stay. A mild fever or stomach ailment could easily escalate into deadly complications within hospital walls. If you manage to survive your initial symptoms, you still face the daunting risk of picking up something far worse before discharge. But perhaps most heartbreaking are medieval hospital wards dedicated specifically to children, filled with sickly infants and toddlers whose frail immune systems stood little chance against rampant infection. Medieval infant mortality was tragically high, hospitals offering little protection and often inadvertently accelerating death. Families desperate for help entrusted their children to hospitals, only to watch helplessly as conditions worsened, grief and guilt compounding their tragedy. Medieval hospitals' greatest failure wasn't lack of compassion, but lack of knowledge. Caregivers genuinely wanted to help, dedicating their lives to easing suffering. But medieval Europe's limited understanding of hygiene, infection, and disease transmission crippled their efforts. No matter how earnestly monks prayed or diligently caregivers provided comfort, hospitals couldn't save lives without fundamental medical knowledge. As you lie awake, feverish and anxious, listening to your fellow patients' quiet suffering, you realize how tragically inadequate medieval hospitals truly are. Your caregivers genuinely believe they're helping, offering prayers, kindness, simple herbal remedies, but you're painfully aware how limited their efforts truly are. Medieval hospitals represent humanity's earnest attempt to combat disease, but tragically, they're woefully misguided, inadvertently increasing suffering instead of easing it. Tomorrow, you may wake weaker, your condition deteriorating further, even if your caregivers offer comforting prayers, warm broth, and compassionate whispers. These gestures can't replace genuine medical intervention. Medieval hospitals illustrate the heartbreaking gap between humanity's good intentions and medical ignorance. a harsh reminder of how vulnerable medieval people remained, even within supposed sanctuaries. Tonight, as you drift uneasily towards sleep, surrounded by sickness and despair, you understand why medieval hospitals inspired more fear than hope. Without hygiene, without medical knowledge, without genuine healing, your chances of survival remain terrifyingly slim. Rest well if you can. And tomorrow, perhaps say a quiet prayer for medieval Europe's earnest but tragically inadequate attempts at medical care. Good luck, you're definitely going to need it. The dull ache of your persistent fever pulls you from a restless sleep. You slowly open your eyes, squinting into the dim morning light that streams weakly through the small windows of the hospital ward. Standing beside your bed, grinning reassuringly, is a familiar face, your local barber. But hold on, what's he doing here? Holding a frightening array of sharp metal instruments, unfortunately for you, in medieval Europe, the line between barber and surgeon is dangerously blurred. That's right, the same man who trims your beard, cuts your hair, and perhaps even offers some questionable gossip is also your trusted medieval surgeon. Barber surgeons perform everything from routine bloodletting to amputations, tooth extractions, and even battlefield surgery. Comforting, isn't it? If you thought your earlier visits to medieval physicians were unsettling, brace yourself. Things are about to get a whole lot worse. Without hesitation, your barber surgeon begins unpacking his tools onto a battered wooden table, spreading out an alarming collection of saws, knives, probes, and pincers, all alarmingly sharp, though disturbingly unclean. Sterilization, antiseptic precautions. Not exactly medieval priorities. Your barber surgeon casually wipes his tools on his stained apron, hardly reassuring as you watch him prepare for whatever terrifying procedure he's planning. As bizarre as it sounds, medieval barber surgeons genuinely formed an important pillar of healthcare in medieval communities. Trained through apprenticeships, barber surgeons learned practical skills primarily through experience rather than formal study. Many lacked even basic literacy, relying instead on observation and practice. If you're wondering how competent your barber surgeon actually is, let's just say you'd better hope he's learned from plenty of past mistakes, though preferably not today. Historically, the role of barber surgeon developed from practical necessity. Medieval physicians often viewed surgery as crude manual labour beneath their scholarly dignity. Leaving these dirty jobs to barber surgeons allowed physicians to focus on diagnosing humoral imbalances and prescribing herbal remedies. But what medieval doctors considered beneath them amputations, wound treatments, abscess drainings often meant life or death for ordinary people. As your barber surgeon approaches your bedside, examining your swollen, infected leg, you brace yourself nervously. Without modern anaesthetics, pain management in medieval surgery is virtually non-existent. Your barber surgeon might offer a sip of strong alcohol if you're lucky, but mostly you're expected to endure the agony stoically. And trust me, medieval surgical procedures were as brutal as they sound. Simple tooth extractions involved gripping teeth with crude metal pincers, wrenching painfully until the offending tooth finally released its stubborn hold. Surgery on infected limbs often meant rapid, rough amputations performed with saws and knives, patients writhing helplessly. But medieval barber surgeons weren't entirely without skill or ingenuity. Historians still argue whether their practical, hands-on approach occasionally provided genuine benefits. barber surgeons successfully treated wounds by cleaning them with vinegar or wine, rudimentary disinfectants that somewhat reduced infection risk, even if medieval surgeons had no idea why. Setting broken bones, stitching wounds closed with silk thread, draining painful abscesses, these basic procedures genuinely helped countless medieval patients survive otherwise fatal injuries. Unfortunately, despite occasional successes, medieval barber surgeons often did more harm than good, primarily due to limited hygiene and brutal surgical techniques. Without sterile instruments or basic germ theory, surgeries frequently ended with severe infections. An otherwise minor wound could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to agonizing complications or even death. If you survive the initial shock and pain of surgery, your next ordeal battling infection might prove even more challenging, even more terrifyingly. Medieval barber surgeons often rushed through procedures. Speed was prized above precision, surgeons boasting proudly about how quickly they could amputate limbs or extract teeth. Medieval barber surgeons measured their skill not by patients' comfort or successful outcomes, but by sheer speed and bravado. No wonder patients approached medieval surgery with dread. Each procedure was essentially a race against time, performed by men determined to prove their expertise through sheer, brutal efficiency. Medieval barber surgeons also had an unsettling tendency to multitask. When not performing surgery, they shaved beards, cut hair, and even offered cosmetic procedures. Imagine the same man casually trimming your beard in the morning, then amputating your neighbour's gangrenous leg that afternoon. It's a disturbing thought, highlighting medieval healthcare's strange blend of mundane routines and life-or-death procedures. If you're wondering why medieval patients trusted these barber surgeons at all, it's partly because they had no real choice. Physicians often refused surgical procedures entirely, leaving barber surgeons as the only available option for treatment. Medieval patients, desperate, frightened, and in severe pain, simply hoped for the best, praying their barber surgeon's practical experience outweighed his lack of formal training. Your barber surgeon, having examined your infected leg, now shakes his head sadly, muttering ominously about bad humours. You brace yourself nervously as he picks up his saw, preparing for what medieval people grimly called the only solution. Amputation, painful, traumatic, dangerous, was tragically common in medieval surgery, often used as a drastic measure to prevent gangrene spreading. As your barber surgeon moves swiftly into action, you close your eyes, biting down on a rag offered to muffle screams. Pain washes through you, overwhelming, relentless, but medieval surgery allows no respite, no mercy. Ironically, the brutal speed with which your barber surgeon works might be your only chance at survival, assuming infection doesn't claim you afterward. Tonight, lying weak and traumatized in your hospital bed, you realize medieval barber surgeons represent both humanity's incredible resilience and terrifying ignorance. Their willingness to tackle painful, brutal procedures despite limited knowledge and tools is strangely admirable, yet profoundly disturbing. Medieval surgery embodies the ultimate gamble, patients desperately hoping practical skill outweighs crude methods and dubious hygiene. As you drift uneasily towards sleep, leg freshly bandaged and aching horribly, you understand medieval surgery's tragic paradox. Your only hope for survival also carries enormous risk. Tomorrow, infection might claim you another victim of medieval medicine's brutal ignorance, but tonight, at least, you've survived, albeit barely. Rest well, assuming pain and anxiety allow. Good luck, you're definitely going to need it. Lying restless in your hospital bed, your mind drifting between pain and uneasy sleep, you begin to question what exactly brought you here. Medieval medicine has offered little comfort. Your leg throbs from recent surgery, and your apothecary's concoctions have only added nausea to your woes. Desperation sinks deeper, pushing you closer to remedies that have less to do with medicine and more with medieval superstition, those peculiar cures whispered quietly in dark corners by village elders or prescribed openly by desperate healers. And so tonight, with conventional methods failing you, superstition emerges as your healer's final solution. Your physician approaches cautiously, bearing not herbs or surgical tools, but instead an assortment of items that feel utterly bizarre. He unwraps an oddly shaped stone, carefully places a dried toad on your bedside, and sprinkles salt around your mattress, murmuring quietly in Latin. These practices may seem absurd, but superstition and folklore played enormous roles in medieval healing. When legitimate treatments failed, medieval people often turned desperately to rituals, charms, and magical cures. In your fevered state, you watch anxiously as your healer picks up the dried toad. He solemnly explains that toads, especially when dried or powdered, hold special protective powers against infections and disease. A dried toad worn in a pouch around the neck could supposedly ward off plague, cure fevers, or even reverse curses. Historians still argue whether medieval healers genuinely believed these remedies effective or simply exploited desperate villagers for profit. Either way, you're now the proud, reluctant owner of a dead amphibian charm. Lucky you. Medieval superstition doesn't stop at dried animals. Ever heard of sympathetic magic? It involves performing rituals that symbolically imitate the desired effect. For instance, your healer might carefully pierce an onion with a pin and place it near your bedside, believing this action will magically draw infection or pain from your body into the vegetable. Ridiculous. Maybe, but desperate medieval patients embrace such practices, clinging to any tiny hope that might ease their suffering. And it wasn't just onions and toads. Medieval superstitions could be startlingly imaginative. Villagers might place live chickens at the feet of sick patients, believing chickens absorbed illness through their feathers. Or perhaps your healer advises writing your feverish symptoms onto parchment, then burning the paper at sunrise, hoping the flames consume sickness, along with the words. Medieval medicine's intersection with magic was vivid, theatrical, and often spectacularly impractical, but undeniably fascinating. If you're skeptical about the effectiveness of these rituals, you're not alone, yet medieval villagers earnestly trusted these practices, passed down through generations. Superstitious cures offered comfort, an illusion of control amidst terrifying vulnerability. With genuine medical solutions limited, superstition provided psychological solace, even if actual healing remained elusive. In desperate cases, superstition even influenced entire medieval communities. Villages held collective rituals, lighting bonfires to drive away disease or evil spirits. Bells rang loudly from churches, believing the sound waves purified the air. Town elders declared public fasts or mass prayers, convinced communal penance could end disease outbreaks. Tragically, such large gatherings often inadvertently accelerated contagion, yet medieval villagers clung stubbornly to their beliefs, desperate for anything resembling protection. Some superstitious treatments bordered on truly bizarre. For example, A medieval cure for toothache involved touching the tooth with a splinter from a tree struck by lightning, supposedly transferring lightning's protective energy. Your healer might prescribe drinking powder gemstones, believing crushed emerald or sapphire could heal internal ailments, though consuming expensive ground rocks rarely ended well. These methods, though completely irrational from a modern perspective, illustrate medieval people's intense yearning for relief. Even astrology, already influential in medieval medicine, blended seamlessly with superstition. Healers timed treatments precisely according to planetary alignments. A headache might be treated only when the moon was waning, fevers ideally cured under certain constellations. Your physician solemnly consults astrological charts before performing even basic procedures. Convinced celestial positions dictated your body's response. It's easy to dismiss as absurd now, but medieval people took astrology deadly seriously, believing it held genuine medicinal power. Sometimes superstitions evolved from practical insights, distorted over generations. For instance, medieval villagers sometimes prescribed garlic necklaces to ward off illness. Garlic genuinely possesses antibacterial properties, though medieval healers didn't understand why. Likewise, rituals involving burning herbs had some genuine benefits, purifying air or repelling insects carrying diseases. Historians still debate whether medieval healers intuitively sensed these practical benefits or stumbled upon them accidentally, wrapping genuine cures in layers of superstition and magic. But many superstitions provided no real benefits beyond psychological comfort, though medieval people desperately believed otherwise. Rituals involving amulets, talismans, protective charms carved from wood or stone offered villagers fleeting reassurance amidst frightening uncertainty. These items, worn religiously, gave medieval patients something tangible to cling to, a physical token symbolizing hope, even when actual healing remained elusive. As your healer finishes his ritual, carefully arranging protective charms around your bed, you lie quietly, hoping these symbolic gestures might somehow ease your suffering. Rationally, you recognize these superstitious rituals probably won't heal you, but desperation makes you less dismissive. Medieval superstition embodies humanity's timeless need for hope, reassurance, anything to believe in when medical knowledge falls short. Tonight, lying uneasily beneath blankets scattered with dried herbs and odd charms, you understand medieval superstition's tragic appeal. Unable to genuinely understand disease, medieval villagers desperately grasp for comfort, security, some small illusion of control, even if purely symbolic. Superstition offered psychological solace, temporarily quieting anxiety, even when physical healing remained heartbreakingly elusive. As your eyelids grow heavy, fevered exhaustion finally overcoming anxiety, you silently hope these strange rituals might somehow work. Rationally, you know better, but desperation overrides skepticism. Medieval superstition promises hope even fleeting, irrational hope when rational medicine fails utterly. Rest well tonight surrounded by dried toads, onions pierced with pins, and gemstone powders. And remember, in medieval Europe, sometimes superstition felt like your only hope, tragically misguided, yet undeniably comforting. Sweet dreams assuming medieval magic lets you sleep. You stir awake in the cold grey dawn, heart quickening at the sudden sound of hammering outside your door. The unmistakable scrape of wood against stone echoes ominously. A chill runs through you, not just from your lingering fever, but because you realize exactly what's happening. Your neighbors, desperate and frightened, have decided to quarantine you, sealing you inside your home in a medieval effort to halt the plague's relentless march. Isolation, medieval style, has arrived, and it's anything but comforting. In medieval Europe, quarantine methods were rudimentary and often brutal. With no reliable way to identify or treat contagious diseases, frightened villagers resorted to barricading infected homes, believing isolation was their only hope of protection. Unfortunately, such quarantines often became death traps, condemning sick and healthy alike to suffer together behind sealed doors. You rush weakly to your small window, peering anxiously through grimy glass. Outside, grim-faced villagers hastily erect barriers, boards nailed firmly across your doorway, heavy stones stacked to block exit routes. Fear is etched deeply into their expressions. They're terrified, desperate, and convinced sealing you away will somehow save the community. Medieval quarantine isn't just isolation, it's exile. Inside your rapidly darkening room, panic rises swiftly. You pound weakly against the barricaded door, pleading desperately with your neighbours, but your cries fall on deaf ears. Fear breeds cruelty, and medieval villagers, terrified of contagion, can't risk compassion even for neighbours and friends. They retreat hastily, eyes averted, whispering prayers and crossing themselves nervously. You're left utterly alone, sealed inside your own home, helplessly awaiting whatever fate, illness or starvation decides for you. Ironically, medieval quarantine measures sometimes inadvertently increase suffering rather than reducing it. Trapping entire families together meant healthy individuals inevitably contracted diseases from infected relatives. Even worse, quarantined families faced severe shortages of food, water, and medical supplies, turning quarantine into a grim waiting game, a slow, agonizing decline rather than genuine protection. Yet medieval villagers had few alternatives. With no vaccines, antibiotics, or even basic understanding of disease transmission, isolation seemed their only practical solution. Authorities across medieval Europe ordered quarantines frequently, hoping desperately to control diseases like plague, cholera, or smallpox. Unfortunately, medieval quarantines rarely succeeded fully. Disease always slipped through cracks, carried unknowingly by frightened villagers fleeing hastily sealed homes. Historians still argue whether medieval quarantines genuinely slowed contagion or merely provided psychological comfort, an illusion of control amidst terrifying helplessness. Medieval villagers clung desperately to quarantine measures, hoping their sacrifices might somehow end disease outbreaks, even as isolation tragically increased suffering behind sealed doors. Inside your quarantined home, conditions quickly deteriorate. Food supplies dwindle alarmingly fast, clean water becomes scarce, and untreated illness worsens steadily. Sanitation, already precarious in medieval Europe, plummets further, your quarantined home soon filled with accumulating waste, attracting vermin and disease-carrying insects. Medieval quarantine wasn't just lonely, it was dangerously unhygienic. Even basic medical care becomes impossible during quarantine. Physicians and healers refuse to enter quarantined homes, fearing contagion. Desperate villagers sometimes risk delivering herbal remedies through small gaps or windows, but such efforts are rare, often ineffective. Mostly, quarantined individuals suffered entirely alone, denied even comforting prayers or whispered reassurances. Medieval quarantine stripped away even basic human kindness, replacing compassion with cold, fearful isolation. Yet incredibly, medieval people occasionally showed remarkable courage and compassion during quarantine. Brave individuals secretly delivered food, water, or medicine to sealed homes, risking their own lives for neighbours and family. Priests offered comfort through closed doors, whispering prayers or leaving tokens of spiritual solace on doorsteps. Medieval quarantine sometimes brought out humanity's finest qualities, though tragically. Compassion often carried deadly risks, sadly. Medieval quarantine wasn't limited solely to individual homes. Entire neighbourhoods, even towns, might find themselves sealed off, surrounded by hastily erected barricades or patrolled by armed guards. Medieval quarantine created ghost towns, eerily silent and desolate. Villagers trapped within barricades faced starvation, disease, and despair, unable to escape contagion, unable to seek help. Medieval quarantine turned entire communities into prisons. You pace anxiously inside your quarantined home, fear and loneliness quickly overwhelming rational thought. Medieval quarantine doesn't just isolate physically, it isolates psychologically. Without human contact, anxiety spirals rapidly, depression deepens, and despair sets in. Medieval quarantine, especially prolonged isolation, inflicted severe psychological damage, leaving survivors emotionally traumatized long after quarantine ended. Even survivors emerging from quarantine faced tragic consequences. Medieval villagers, terrified of contagion, often ostracized survivors, refusing contact or interaction. Quarantine survivors found themselves stigmatized, shunned, feared even when entirely recovered. Medieval quarantine didn't just isolate during illness, it isolated permanently, branding survivors with suspicion and fear long after disease faded. Yet medieval quarantine, despite its brutality, laid foundations for modern disease control measures. Concepts of isolation, containment, and contagion management developed gradually from medieval quarantine practices. Historians still debate whether medieval quarantine represented genuine medical insight or simply desperate attempts at control, but its legacy endures, shaping modern healthcare profoundly. Tonight, locked within your quarantined home, fear and loneliness deepening with every passing hour, you understand medieval quarantine's tragic duality. Isolation provided comfort, an illusion of control against invisible threats, but also inflicted profound suffering, stripping away compassion, community, and basic human kindness. Medieval quarantine embodies humanity's desperate struggle against disease, tragically misguided, yet undeniably earnest. As darkness deepens, your neighbour's distant murmurs fading gradually into silence, you lie quietly, hoping medieval quarantine might somehow spare you, though rationally. You know better. Trapped, isolated, terrified, you realise quarantine's harsh truth. Medieval isolation rarely protected effectively. Instead, it compounded suffering, inflicted deep psychological scars, and left survivors permanently altered. Rest uneasily tonight, sealed away, abandoned by frightened neighbours, utterly alone. Medieval quarantine offered little comfort, only cruel, fearful isolation, and tragically slim odds of genuine protection. Sleep if you can, but medieval quarantine rarely allowed peace. Sweet dreams, or at least good luck. You'll certainly need it. The dawn comes slowly, grey and reluctant, casting pale light on the barricaded door of your home. You haven't eaten in 2 days. Water is running low. You're still feverish, still weak. But worse than the physical pain is the unbearable silence. No footsteps outside, no voices. You are completely alone until a soft knock breaks the quiet. You drag yourself to the window. Outside, wrapped in a dark woolen cloak, stands a figure you recognize, not your physician, not the apothecary, but the village priest. In medieval Europe, the line between medicine and religion is not just thin, it's virtually non-existent. If nothing else has worked, it's time to call in divine intervention. He looks up and crosses himself. You do the same. He doesn't come inside, of course. That would be foolish, even to the deeply faithful. Instead, he opens a small book and begins to recite Latin prayers softly through the wooden slats. You rest your head against the wall and listen. It's not a cure, not even close. But in a world where medical options are as terrifying as the disease, prayer offers the one thing nothing else has: comfort. In medieval times, the church was more than a spiritual guide, it was the core of the healthcare system. Monasteries operated the earliest hospitals. Monks and nuns were among the few who could read medical texts, albeit outdated and mostly copied from Galenic theory. Healing the body and healing the soul were seen as the same mission. Illness wasn't just physical, it was moral, even spiritual. If you were sick, it might be because you sinned. So, your first treatment isn't necessarily medicine, it's confession. The priest's voice continues, a soft rhythm outside your door, praying for your healing, for your forgiveness, for your soul's peace if death comes soon. He slips a small wooden crucifix through the window and tells you to keep it close. You clutch it tightly, more for what it represents than any real belief that it can change the outcome. But then again, belief is medicine of its own kind, isn't it? Medieval medicine is full of contradictions, none more striking than the relationship between church and clinic. On one hand, monks painstakingly copy ancient texts on anatomy and herb lore. On the other, the church often prohibits dissection of the human body, calling it sacrilege. Religious authorities promote hospitals, yet also push for exorcisms when ailments are deemed spiritual. Historians still argue whether the church helped or hindered the advancement of medicine, but one thing's certain: if you're sick in the Middle Ages, your priest is often your most accessible doctor. Sometimes, the only available treatment is mass. In plague years, entire communities attend outdoor services, led by clergy holding relics aloft, bones of saints, strips of holy robes, or vials of what's claimed to be Mary's tears. People believe proximity to these objects can cure illness, or at least buy favour in the afterlife. The idea that a higher power determines your health is both comforting and terrifying, because if you stay sick, it's not just your body failing, it's your soul under judgment. And this belief fuels another dangerous reality: not everyone is seen as deserving of healing. If you're poor, female, foreign, or just a little too strange, medieval society might blame your illness on personal sin, moral failing, or even worse, witchcraft. It's a twisted logic if God is punishing you with sickness. You must have done something wrong, and if your suffering seems especially severe or strange, people might whisper that you're possessed, a demon in your belly, a curse in your blood. Before you know it, your priest is being asked not just to pray for you, but to drive something out of you. Exorcisms, believe it or not, were sometimes considered a viable treatment for medical conditions. Seizures, obviously demonic possession, hallucinations, a spiritual invasion, chronic pain. witchcraft, maybe from a jealous neighbour. Your priest may arrive with holy water, chanting in Latin, flicking droplets across your bed as he commands invisible forces to leave your body. You're not sure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. Oddly enough, some of these rituals had a placebo effect. The sheer ceremony of it, the incense, the chants, the community gathering in hope might actually ease someone's symptoms. And even when it didn't, the act of being surrounded, supported, spiritually attended to, well, it was better than being alone with your suffering. Monasteries, meanwhile, sometimes got things right. Their herb gardens were lush and well tended, offering real treatments like mint, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Warm broth from a monastery kitchen might do more than any physician's prescription. The rhythm of prayer and rest, simple food, and care basic things, yes, but surprisingly effective compared to bloodletting or mercury ointments. Still, even the monks could only do so much. Prayer doesn't close wounds. Confession doesn't stop infections. Relics don't rebuild immune systems. As you lie back down, wrapped in a thin blanket and soaked in sweat, your crucifix held loosely in your hand, you understand this all too well, and yet part of you wants to believe it matters, that someone, somewhere, is interceding for you, that your name, spoken aloud in a quiet chapel by candlelight, might tip the cosmic balance in your favour, that you might, somehow, still be spared. Tonight, as the priest's voice fades and your fever returns, you whisper your own prayer, not sure who's listening, or if anyone is. You don't need a miracle. You'd settle for a warm bath and some clean water, but in the Middle Ages, miracles are often all you have. The priest's prayers linger in your mind as night falls again, the fever curling back into your limbs like a returning tide. You toss beneath the blanket, weak and sweat-soaked, and your stomach growls with an almost feral emptiness. You reach for the last piece of stale bread left near your bed. It crumbles like dust between your fingers. There's no food coming. No one's bringing water. You're on your own now. And the truth finally hits you with full weight. You're starving and your body is too weak to fight back. In medieval Europe, nutrition isn't just poor, it's perilous. For the average peasant, daily meals consist of little more than pottage, a thin gruel of boiled grains and vegetables, the occasional scrap of salted meat, and endless loaves of coarse, dark bread. Vegetables are limited by season. Meat is a rare luxury. And fruit, that's for people with orchards and teeth. If you're already sick, your body's demand for nourishment increases. But in the Middle Ages, sickness and starvation often go hand in hand. Villagers believed you had to starve a fever, a terrible idea when your immune system is already on its last legs. If you're lucky, someone might offer you broth, thin and oily, made from bones that had already been boiled twice. Most of the time, even that's too much to hope for. There's a cruel irony to the medieval kitchen. Most of the things that could actually help you recover vitamin-rich vegetables, lean protein, fresh water are either unavailable or viewed with suspicion. Tomatoes and potatoes. Not introduced to Europe yet, oranges, exotic and rare. Even milk is a mixed blessing. With no refrigeration, it spoils fast. And by the time it reaches your cup, it might do more harm than good. Historians still argue how much medieval people really understood about nutrition. Monastic texts praised moderation and herbal teas. Folk healers swore by certain warming foods during illness: garlic, onion, ginger, if you could find it. but the average peasant, you eat what you have, not what you need, and sometimes what you have turns on you. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye in damp conditions, finds its way into bread supplies more often than you'd like to imagine. People unknowingly eat it and begin to hallucinate, convulse, or develop gangrene in their limbs. It's sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, a name that sounds poetic until your fingers start turning black. Imagine being ill, weak, and then watching your hands rot while people argue whether it's a disease or a punishment. Ergot poisoning killed thousands in the Middle Ages, and worse still, no one could identify it. If your bread kills you, people just call it bad luck or divine judgment, and food alone isn't the only issue. Clean water is practically a myth. Wells are often shallow and contaminated. Streams are used as sewers. You might boil your water if you can afford firewood. So most people drink ale, even children. Low alcohol small beer is safer than water, but not exactly hydrating when you're running a fever. And wine reserved for the upper crust, for the rest of us. Dehydration is a constant gnawing threat. Still, even nobles feasting on rich meats, cheeses, and honeyed desserts suffer nutritional imbalance. The medieval noble diet is heavy on luxury and light on logic. Constipation, gout, kidney stones, common ailments for the wealthy. Meanwhile, the poor slowly waste away from lack of basic nutrients. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, is a common but mysterious affliction. Your gums bleed, teeth loosen, joints ache. No one connects it to diet. It's just one more plague in a long list of unnamed medieval miseries, and don't even get started on fasting. The church mandates dozens of fasting days each year. Fridays, Lent, Advent, Ember days. Meat is forbidden, but fish is allowed if you can afford it. In theory, fasting brings you closer to God. In practice, it leaves already malnourished peasants teetering on the brink of collapse. When you're sick, starving is rarely the path to salvation, but try explaining that to your local priest. Tonight, as you nibble a crust of dry bread, you wonder whether the hunger in your belly or the heat in your chest will take you first. You dream of eggs soft-boiled, warm. You imagine an orange, cool and juicy, bursting with flavour and life. You'd trade a year of labour for one bowl of warm stew with fresh carrots, real herbs, and a chunk of roasted meat. But those dreams fade quickly. You chew slowly, not from choice but from the need to make each bite last. You're not eating to recover anymore, you're eating to delay the end. If you were living now, you'd be on IV fluids, antibiotics, a carefully monitored diet. But here, in the Middle Ages, your healing options are as stale as your supper, so you lie back, bones sharp against your thin mattress, your empty stomach still growling beneath layers of fever and fatigue. Food, clean water, nutrition. These are luxuries your world cannot provide. And as your body continues to weaken, you finally understand the cruel truth of medieval illness. It's not just the disease that kills you, it's the hunger that holds your hand along the way. The night air feels heavier now, like the very weight of illness has thickened it. You toss, blankets damp with sweat, lips dry, stomach hollow, and then a sudden, shrill wail slices through the quiet. Not your own voice, a child's, fragile, cracked, coming from the room next to yours. And just like that, you're reminded you're not alone in your suffering. And if being sick in medieval Europe is a death sentence for adults, for children, it's often a foregone conclusion. You manage to sit up, bones aching like rusted hinges, and glance toward the adjacent room, a space once filled with playful chatter and quick little footsteps. Now it's just coughing, deep, wet, rhythmic, like a ticking clock. Medieval childhood is no fairy tale, it's brutal, short, and riddled with peril. Nearly 1 in 3 children never make it past age 5. And if you think that's shocking, consider this surviving birth is only the first of many trials. There's no such thing as prenatal vitamins or sterile delivery rooms. Babies are often delivered at home, in cramped rooms filled with relatives and neighbours, none of them medically trained. The midwife, often the most experienced woman in the village, does her best with herbs, hot water, and whispered prayers. But complications are frequent: hemorrhage, breech births, infections. Newborns are fragile. Mothers, too. And even when a child is born healthy, the threats are constant. They're swaddled tightly, too tightly sometimes, in the belief that it helps their limbs grow straight. Bathed in wine or vinegar to harden them. Fed animal milk or thin gruel if the mother can't nurse. Some infants are weaned too early, others never at all. Diarrhea and dehydration, deadly in any age, cut short countless infant lives before their first birthdays. You think of the little girl next door, coughing until she chokes. In medieval Europe, there's no vaccine for whooping cough, no antibiotics for strep, no inhalers for asthma. A simple cold can spiral into pneumonia in days, and even the most devoted parents can do nothing but hold their children and hope that fever breaks, that the child wakes, that tomorrow comes. Of course, many don't survive, and medieval society, though not heartless, learns early to brace itself. Parents grieve, yes, but they also prepare. Children are often baptized within hours of birth, just in case. They're wrapped in shrouds before they're ever wrapped in school clothes. Tiny graves fill churchyards, marked with stones too small to carry names. Some mothers name every child the same over and over until one finally lives. Historians still debate how deeply parents attach to their children in such a high mortality world. Did they love less, to spare themselves grief, or did they love more, in frantic bursts, never sure how long they had? Likely, it was both. Deep affection wrapped in armour, but superstition, as always, creeps in too. If a child falls ill, neighbours might whisper about curses, about jealous spirits or fairies swapping healthy babies for sickly changelings. Parents are advised to hang iron charms over the cradle, place bread under pillows, even smear animal fat on doorways to ward off evil. If the child improves, the charm worked, if not well. Perhaps it wasn't truly their child after all. You hear movement again, a woman's voice now, low and soft. She's singing, not a lullaby, exactly, but something older, a prayer, a plea. The melody carries a weariness too familiar, that desperate need to do something, anything, when all tools have failed. In wealthier homes, children fare only slightly better. Nobles hire wet nurses, but few understand child nutrition. Wealth buys less risk, not immunity. In plague times, even royal nurseries go silent. Disease doesn't check bloodlines, it just knocks. And what of those who survive? Many do, against all odds. But medieval childhood offers little safety net. Once they can walk, they're working feeding chickens, fetching water, grinding grain. Education is a luxury. Unless you're destined for the church, play exists, but so do broken bones, burns, drowning in shallow wells. There's no childproofing here. The world is sharp, and children are expected to grow up fast or not at all. The girl next door lets out a final cough, then silence. You hold your breath. Did she sleep? Did she stop a few moments later? You hear a soft cry, quieter, weaker, still here, still fighting. You lie back, staring at the ceiling, and feel a sadness settle in your bones that isn't entirely your own. Maybe it's the fever, or maybe it's the awareness that medieval childhood is less a time of innocence and more a race against death. And somehow, the world goes on. The mother sings, the child coughs. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows, another child is born, another one dies. Tonight, as you drift into fevered sleep, you wonder what strength it must take to raise a child in this world, to love something so small, so delicate, knowing it could vanish by morning, and yet they do, again and again. Because even in the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, hope persists quiet, stubborn, and impossibly brave. You wake to scratching at your skin. At first, you think it's the fever playing tricks, but no, it's real. Tiny, crawling pinpricks across your legs, your arms, your neck. You fling off the blanket, and there they are, lice, fleas, the constant companions of medieval life. No matter your status, peasant or priest, merchant or monk, vermin don't discriminate. You are one of them now. Hygiene in the Middle Ages is a concept that exists more in theory than in practice. Baths rare, complicated, and often mistrusted. Soap expensive, hard to come by, and not always effective. Hot water, a luxury, usually reserved for the extremely wealthy or monastic communities. For the average person, clean means not actively muddy, and even that is a stretch. You scratch at your scalp, wincing as nails meet welts. The lice have laid their claim. You pull back your shirt and find flea bites clustering like constellations across your back. It's not just discomfort, it's danger. Because these tiny creatures don't come alone. They bring diseases, plague, typhus, trench fever. Not that you know its name. These are the silent assassins that ride in on flea-infested rats, or jump from human to human through shared straw beds. Your bedding soiled, unchanged for weeks, is a microcosm of medieval microbial horror. Filled with body oils, sweat, excrement and insects, your mattress is more sponge than support, and changing it isn't an option. Straw is scarce, linens are expensive, washing fabric is an ordeal that requires boiling water, a wash tub, strong arms, and hours of labour. So instead, you roll over, ignore the itch, and hope for the best. Even public bathhouses, once fairly common in Roman times, have fallen out of favour by the late Middle Ages. Many have been closed, not just from fear of disease, but fear of sin. Too much nudity, too much temptation. So the church steps in again, warning that public bathing leads to moral corruption. And with that, centuries of bathing culture go down the drain. Instead, people turn to dry cleansing. Combs, linen cloths rubbed on the skin, scented oils to mask the odour, perfumes made from rose water, lavender, even vinegar are dabbed behind ears and onto collars to keep the stench at bay. If you're rich, you change clothes often, but you still don't bathe. In fact, many noblemen fear that water opens the skin's pores and allows illness to enter. Better to be dirty than dead, they reason. Still, monastic orders keep some semblance of sanitation. Monks bathe periodically, usually around 4 times a year. Whether they need it or not, communal baths are organised by rank, with higher monks going first and the novices last, often in the same water. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. Interestingly, medieval doctors do understand that bad air can lead to sickness, but they think it's the smell itself that causes disease, not the bacteria or parasites. Hence the obsession with miasma, bad air. Physicians recommend carrying pomanders, scented balls of herbs or spices to sniff during walks through town. You've even seen people burn rosemary or juniper indoors, not realising that, accidentally, they're mildly disinfecting the air. But despite the lack of soap and showers, there's a certain ingenuity to medieval hygiene practices. People clean their teeth with cloths and chew twigs to scrub their molars. They know wounds should be cleaned with wine or vinegar. They rinse their hands before meals. And in some places, especially Islamic regions of medieval Spain, bathing remains a regular, even sacred practice. But if you're not lucky enough to live there, if you're trapped in a cold stone house with no firewood, no fresh water, and a bed full of fleas, then hygiene is more aspiration than action. You shift in your straw bedding, scratching at a new bite. You wonder how anyone survives this, how your body can fight off infection while constantly bombarded by external threats. You think of the rats nesting in the corners, of chamber pots emptied into the street, of wounds cleaned with dirty rags, of fingernails caked with grime, and suddenly your fever feels like the least of your problems. Historians still debate how much medieval people actually cared about being clean. Some evidence suggests they longed for it, wrote poems about fresh linen, sang songs about clean hair. Others argue that filth was simply normalised, shrugged off as an unavoidable fact of life. Either way, the results were the same: disease spread quickly, minor cuts turned septic, and something as simple as a scratch could bloom into a death sentence. You think back to that phrase you heard once, muttered by a passing monk. The soul must be washed more often than the body. It's clever, yes, but it's also a terrifying glimpse into priorities. When physical health is considered secondary to spiritual purity, people suffer, bodies rot while prayers rise. Tonight, as you drift off again, scalp itching, limbs sore, the air around you thick with your own unwashed scent, you come to terms with a grim reality. In the Middle Ages, cleanliness isn't next to godliness, it's next to impossible. The itch never stops, not in your scalp, not under your arms, not between your toes. You shift constantly, trying to find some position that offers relief, but medieval life doesn't believe in comfort. And now, just to make your personal horror show complete, there's something new, an oozing wound on your leg, hot to the touch, red around the edges. You don't remember injuring yourself, but in a place where skin splits from cold and bacteria live on every surface, injuries don't need invitations. And that, dear listener, brings us to another delightful medieval reality battlefield medicine and all the gruesome tricks it dragged into civilian life. Even if you're not a soldier, the techniques used to patch up knights and footmen often trickle down to the general population. And when we say techniques, think more battlefield triage than hospital care. When limbs are crushed, when arrows pierce muscle and bone, when swords hack through flesh, there's no time for subtlety. There's only one goal: don't die right now. Let's say you were injured in a skirmish or tripped over your own feet in the mud. It doesn't matter. The treatment you'd receive is shockingly similar. The barber surgeon, yes, the same man who cut your cousin's hair last week would examine your wound, sniff it, maybe prod it a little, and then get to work. No anesthesia, no gloves, no antiseptic, just a steady hand, a saw, and hopefully a stomach stronger than yours. The first step in battlefield medicine is always stopping the bleeding. Cauterization is common, searing the wound shut with red-hot iron. The smell. Imagine scorched meat and hair and panic rolled into one. If the bleeding doesn't stop, a tourniquet is applied, and if that doesn't work, well, there's always amputation. Now, you might be thinking surely they only amputate when absolutely necessary. Not quite. In many cases, especially on the battlefield, limbs were removed not because they were unsalvageable, but because surgeons didn't know how to clean deep wounds. Gangrene was poorly understood, and infections couldn't be treated. If a wound looked angry, they cut it off. Better to lose a limb than your life. Although often, you lost both anyway. And don't expect precision. There's no clean surgical theatre here. The tools rusty, the saws unforgiving. The method, speed over accuracy. A good surgeon, they'd say, can take off a leg in under a minute. That's not skill, it's desperation. If you survive the amputation, and that's a big if your next battle was infection, with no antibiotics, no sterile bandages, and little understanding of how germs work, even a well-intentioned surgeon might doom you. They might slather your wound in honey, which actually isn't the worst idea. Raw honey has antimicrobial properties. But they might also apply crushed beetles, moss scraped off tombstones, or mercury-based ointments. So, roll the dice. Even setting broken bones was a terrifying affair. Without x-rays or any real knowledge of anatomy, bones were reset through force and prayer. Splints were made of wood, bark, or cloth. If they weren't tightened just right, the bone healed crooked. Infection could set in through the smallest puncture. One tiny splinter, one missed cut, and your leg might end up looking more like a question mark than a shin. And battlefield tools found their way into civilian use all the time. Hooks to pull out arrows became fishing devices. Tourniquets became cloth belts. Forceps used to remove arrowheads were used during childbirth. Yes, childbirth. There was no line between this is for battle and this is for everyday life. If it worked once, it was considered medicine. Sometimes soldiers who survived horrendous injuries were held up as proof of divine favour. A knight who limped home missing a leg was considered chosen, blessed even. Civilians borrowed this logic if you lived. It meant God still wanted you around. If you didn't, well, must have been your sins. But don't imagine battlefield surgery was always grim and barbaric. There were rare flashes of brilliance. Islamic physicians in the medieval period developed techniques for treating wounds that were centuries ahead of their time. Clean sutures, cautions against reusing tools, even early forms of anesthesia with herbal sedatives. Sadly, much of this knowledge didn't make it far into Western Europe, or if it did, it was drowned out by leeches and lancets. Back in your bed, you stare down at your own leg. That infection isn't going away. It's hot now, puffy, angry, and your healer is talking about draining it with a knife that hasn't been cleaned since last spring. There's talk of tying your leg just in case. You know what that means? Tonight, you dream of saws and smoke, of screams muffled by linen, of blood pooling on wooden floors. You pray your leg heals on its own, that the fever breaks, that the rot doesn't spread. Because you know one thing for sure: if the barber shows up tomorrow with his bone saw, you're not waking up with the same number of limbs. And in medieval Europe, that counts as a win. Another night, Another fever-drenched hallucination. You dream of rot and smoke, of knives in candlelight, of your leg wrapped in damp cloth and prayers. But when morning comes, if you can call this grey haze morning, your leg is still attached. For now. The infection hasn't improved, but it hasn't worsened either. It's a strange sort of victory. You're beginning to accept that survival in the Middle Ages is more a matter of not getting worse than actually getting better. Still, something gnaws at your mind. Not hunger, though, that's always there, but a realization. Slowly blooming, even the most well-meaning cures often hurt more than they help. You've been drained, blistered, bled, burned, and dosed with enough mystery powders to kill a goat, and now, as the infection festers and your strength wanes, you begin to see medieval medicine for what it often is, a gauntlet of remedies worse than the disease itself. Take, for example, one of your healer's recent ideas, a mercury ointment. Yes, mercury the shimmery, silvery metal you were warned not to touch in science class. In the Middle Ages, it's applied directly to your skin in the belief that it will draw out illness. What it actually does is soak into your body and poison you slowly. Your gums swell, your teeth loosen, your mind fogs. But the real kicker, your healer takes that as a good sign. The poison is leaving you, he says with confidence. In truth, it's only arriving. Or consider the application of hot plasters, thick, sticky mixtures made of herbs, ash, animal fat, and occasionally crushed insects. They're slapped onto wounds and left for hours or days. Some are soothing, others pull your skin off with them when removed. Either way, your body is covered in burns, boils, rashes, and still no healing. One day, your healer brings out a live pigeon. He presses it against your chest, cooing gently to the bird while explaining that it will absorb your disease. You're too tired to protest. The bird wriggles in his hands, confused and probably terrified. After a few minutes, it's removed dead. See, he nods. It worked. You stare blankly at the lifeless bird and wonder what exactly worked. Historians still argue whether these rituals were meant to treat the body, or simply give everyone, healer and patient, a sense of doing something. Then there's the technique of blistering burning, or irritating healthy skin to create blisters, which are then burst and drained. The logic: your body will focus on healing the self-inflicted injury, which might distract it from the real illness. It's like lighting a fire in your kitchen to stop one in your attic. Ineffective. Definitely. Painful. Always. And don't forget purging. Your healer insists that the foulness inside you must be expelled, so you're given herbs that induce violent vomiting, or worse, uncontrollable diarrhea. Your body convulses, your stomach empties, your strength plummets. That's the disease leaving you, they say, handing you another dose. It's a bit like being pushed down the stairs and told it's good for your posture. Even more bewildering is the idea of therapeutic scarring. For some ailments, especially chronic ones, your healer might suggest carving small, deliberate cuts into your skin, then rubbing in irritants like salt or garlic to draw out the illness. The result: infection on top of infection, pain on top of pain. You're already fighting for your life, and now you're covered in weeping wounds administered by someone who means well but doesn't understand what they're doing. This is perhaps the most tragic part of it all. They mean well. Your healer isn't a monster. Neither is your apothecary, or your priest, or your neighbour who left dried toads at your door. They're not cruel. They're scared. Everyone is. And when fear meets ignorance, desperation becomes the treatment plan. Some remedies, however, do help accidentally. Honey on wounds, garlic in broth, willow bark tea for fevers. But these are rare sparks in a sea of dark, fumbling guesses. You hold tightly to these small mercies, even as you're buried under layers of more harmful ones. And perhaps most dangerous of all is the certainty with which these treatments are administered. Your healer rarely doubts himself. Confidence drips from his every move, even as he hands you a potion that makes your tongue swell and your vision blur. That's part of the process, he says, patting your hand. You nod, too weak to argue, too broken to resist. It feels like being smothered by a friend who swears they're saving you. Tonight, as you lie in silence, your body aching from incisions and poultices, from blistering and purging, you understand a painful truth sometimes. Dying of the disease might have been the easier option, but here you are, still breathing, still hurting, still hoping, because maybe tomorrow something might actually work, or maybe the pigeon will. You wake in the dead of night with a parched mouth and the strange, creeping sensation of thirst wrapping its claws around your throat. Your tongue feels like rough parchment. You shift in your bedding, wincing. Every joint aches. Your fever pulses. And though you've endured more terrifying treatments than you can count, you suddenly realize you haven't had a sip of clean water in days. Water in the Middle Ages isn't something you trust. It's something you avoid unless you absolutely have to. And now, as you lie there dizzy and sweating, it strikes you just how dangerous that fact truly is. Back then, no one really understands what's in the water, only that it often makes people sick. They don't know about bacteria or parasites, but they know something's wrong. A person drinks from the river and dies a few days later. Another develops strange stomach cramps, diarrhea, or skin sores. The patterns are obvious, but the explanations are muddled. Maybe the water is cursed, maybe it's been poisoned, maybe it simply disagrees with some temperaments. The truth, it's filthy. Almost all of it. In a typical medieval village, clean water is a fantasy. Wells are shallow and easily contaminated. Rivers and streams double as laundromats, sewers and garbage dumps. People bathe upstream and relieve themselves downstream, often within the same stretch of water. Tanners dump chemical-laden runoff from leather production. Butchers clean carcasses on the banks. And if you live in a city, multiply that filth tenfold. You try not to think about it. But the truth is inescapable. Every sip you take might carry death. Still, the body needs water. Fever burns through your fluids quickly. You're sweating more than you thought possible. Your lips cracked. Your skin sticky and hot. Dehydration isn't a distant threat, it's knocking on the door. And in the Middle Ages, it often arrives quietly, killing faster than whatever illness brought it on. So what do people drink instead? Mostly ale weak. Low alcohol beer called small beer. It's safer than water because it's boiled during brewing, killing off some pathogens. Even children drink it, but it doesn't hydrate well. And if you're sick, if you're vomiting or have diarrhea, it's no help. In fact, it might make things worse. Milk rare, perishable, and likely to go sour before it ever reaches your cup. Fruit juice. Only if you're rich, and even then, it's usually fermented. What about boiling water? Logical. Yes, but firewood is scarce, expensive, and you're too weak to light anything. Plus, Most people don't realize boiling kills anything, so unless you're in a monastery or a very lucky home, your options are limited. You remember a time, days ago perhaps, when your healer brought you a tin cup filled with cloudy water. He'd thrown in a few herbs, mint and sage, maybe, and said a short prayer over it. You drank it because you were desperate, and you got worse. Historians still argue whether medieval people actively feared water or simply accepted its dangers as part of life. Some documents suggest people preferred wine or ale because they knew water made them sick. Others show that water was used for cooking, washing, even healing sometimes without issue. But none of that changes your reality when you're sick and dehydrated. Clean water can mean the difference between life and death, and you don't have any. You shift again, swallowing thickly. Your lips stick together. Your throat is raw. You dream of icy water pouring over your tongue, of clear streams tumbling over rocks, of a clay cup filled to the brim and held in steady hands. But when you reach for the tin cup beside your bed, it's empty. A single dead fly floats inside. You think of people who've died just like this, not from wounds, not from plague, but from the slow, quiet failure of thirst, a dry mouth, a pounding head, sunken eyes, muscle cramps, confusion. You've seen it. People babble, then slip into silence, and by the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's too late. And yet, even when people do find water, the risks remain. In some parts of Europe, springs are guarded like holy relics, blessed and protected. Their water's said to heal everything from skin lesions to infertility. Pilgrims travel miles to drink from these sacred wells. Sometimes they actually get better, though it's unclear whether from spiritual blessing or sheer luck. There are even water-based superstitions. Some believe placing iron nails in your bucket can strengthen the water. Others swear by collecting dew at dawn fresh, untouched by man or beast. It sounds poetic. Sure, but it won't help you now. Your hands shake as you search for anything wet. You find a piece of cloth by your bedside, damp with old sweat. It's disgusting, but your tongue grazes it anyway. It tastes like salt and desperation. You're not proud, but pride doesn't hydrate. And somewhere, beneath all of this, you start to wonder how many people in the Middle Ages died not because they were fatally ill, but because the very thing they needed to fight that illness simply wasn't available. Clean water isn't a miracle, it's a foundation. And without it, even the best medieval remedies are dust in the wind. Tonight, as your fever rises and your body cries out for something cold, clear and safe, you whisper a simple wish not for divine healing, not for magical herbs, not for the latest theory on humours. Just water, that's all. Just water. You don't remember falling asleep. You never really do anymore. One moment you're staring at the ceiling, the next you're pulled into dark, disjointed dreams where faces blur and prayers echo. You wake to the sound of your own breath shallow, uneven, and realize that something has changed. Your healer is here again. You didn't hear him come in. He's speaking softly with someone you don't recognize, a woman, younger than the rest, with steady hands and eyes that don't look away from your wound. She carries a satchel filled not with charms or live birds, but tools, simple ones, yes, but clean, organized, and purposeful. This is no ordinary villager. She's a healer of a different kind. Perhaps a local wise woman. Perhaps an apprentice trained by someone who reads more than just scripture. She doesn't begin with prayers or bleeding. She begins by listening. She asks when your fever started, how long your leg has been inflamed, what you've eaten. She checks your pulse not because she believes in magical rhythms, but because she's learned to read the body's hidden signals. She cleans your wound with warm water boiled, then cooled. She touches it with a salve that smells of honey and lavender, and for the first time in days, something in you settles. This woman is part of a fragile, often overlooked network of medieval caregivers, people who heal not through books or bloodletting, but through knowledge passed down quietly from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour. They know which herbs soothe pain, which teas ease fevers, which poultices reduce swelling. They understand wounds, childbirth, digestion, poison, and recovery not through divine inspiration, but through centuries of careful observation. And yet, despite their quiet effectiveness, these healers live under constant threat. A whisper of witchcraft, a complaint from a jealous neighbour, and everything they know their remedies, their wisdom, their lives could vanish in a public fire. Historians still argue about how much of this underground medicine was science, how much was luck. But one thing is certain, these quiet healers were often the only ones who genuinely made people better, not because they had divine power, but because they paid attention. The woman working on your leg now doesn't make promises. She doesn't mention spirits or planetary alignments. She doesn't say, "This will cure you." She says, "This might help," and she means it. You wonder how many people like her have existed in the shadows of this brutal system. Not noble physicians trained in Latin, not robed monks with incense, not barber surgeons with bloody aprons, but ordinary people who simply knew how to care. There's something radical about her approach. She washes her hands before touching you. She uses fresh linen instead of a reused cloth. When she applies the poultice, she doesn't press hard, doesn't mutter spells, doesn't explain your suffering away as divine punishment. She just looks at you, nods once and says, "Rest." And somehow your body listens. In another time, she might be a doctor, a nurse, a researcher. In this one, she's tolerated but barely. Because knowledge, when it doesn't come from scripture or noble lips, is dangerous. If she's right too often, someone will accuse her. If she cures too many people, someone will fear her. But still, she shows up. She packs her tools quietly, tells your caregiver to change the dressing in the morning, advises more broth, less ale, a sprig of thyme under your tongue, a slice of apple if they can find it, and above all, water, clean water, as much as you can take. Then she's gone without ceremony, without payment, just a nod, and for the first time since you fell ill, the room feels survivable. You lie back, your leg tingling, not hurting, exactly just aware. You take a few sips from the cup left by your bed. Cool, clear water. You blink. Did someone actually boil it later? You'll learn her name maybe. Maybe not. Maybe she'll vanish, called elsewhere. Maybe she'll be gone before your fever breaks. That's the thing about healers in the Middle Ages. The good ones often don't stay long, but their work does. Tonight, as sleep creeps in, not the fevered collapse of past nights, but something gentler, you realise something remarkable. Maybe you're not getting worse. Maybe, finally, you're getting better. You wake before dawn, not from pain, not from thirst, but from stillness. The fever has lessened. The tight, stifling grip around your chest has loosened its hold. Your leg no longer pulses with that urgent, angry heat. You blink slowly in the grey light, unsure if you're dreaming or awake. Your body feels heavy, but no longer like it's being dragged toward the grave. More like it's simply resting. The house is quiet. Outside, the first coos of pigeons echo through the alley. The streets haven't stirred yet. You are, for the first time in days, or has it been weeks alone with your breath? It enters your lungs, warm and full, and exits without wheeze or rattle. You lived. You're not entirely sure how. Maybe it was the prayers, the herbs, the salves, the water. Maybe it was just chance. Survival, in the Middle Ages, is never owed. It is earned in suffering and granted without explanation. A sick child recovers while a healthy one dies. A peasant clings to life while a nobleman perishes. Even the best healers don't know why some pull through and others fade. Your room is still dim. The same rough stone walls. The same pile of linen turned sponge. The faint stench of sickness still clings to the air, but you are in it, still breathing, still here. Your thoughts, for once, are clear. You lift your hand, slowly, shakily. It obeys. There's something humbling about this moment. You survived a world not designed for survival. You weathered medicine more dangerous than disease, treatment so brutal they left scars of their own. You've been burned, bled, blistered again, and left to starve in quarantine. You've drunk potions you couldn't name, had animals pressed to your skin, and been prayed over by every authority short of the Pope himself. You've watched neighbours vanish behind boarded doors, heard the coughing next door fade into silence. You've listened to rats scurry along your rafters and wondered whether they carried your death with them. You've seen plague masks and holy relics. You've had blood taken from your arm and hope taken from your chest. And yet, you're still here. A faint knock on the door pulls you back. Carefully, achingly, you swing your legs over the side of the bed. Your muscles protest, but they move. The door creaks open, and a familiar face peeks in. Not the physician, not the barber surgeon, the healer, the quiet one. She nods. Still with us, she murmurs, almost to herself. You manage the smallest smile. It's all you can give. She checks your bandage, offers you a cup of water, cool, clean, no floating bits, no strange aftertaste, just water. She hands you a small piece of bread, soft, with a hint of rosemary. You chew slowly, savouring the taste of life creeping back into your body. She doesn't stay long. These healers never do. There are other homes, other rooms, other battles being fought in whispered silence. She gathers her things, leaves without ceremony, and now it's just you again. You lie back, eyes half closed, and think about what you've endured, what this world expects you to endure. Being sick in the Middle Ages isn't just a health crisis. It's a war, a test, a descent into rituals, guesses, and grim realities. It is blood and herbs and superstition. It is silence, isolation, and the creak of death's door swinging half open. And somehow, against the odds, you've pulled that door shut. So now, as the story dims and your breathing slows, let the last of this journey settle gently behind your eyes. You've travelled through a world where illness was a mystery, where medicine was a mixture of hope and harm, and where survival meant not just strength, but luck. Let your mind drift now from the cracked stone floors and smoky rafters of medieval homes to somewhere softer. Let go of the bloodletting, the bitter herbs, the fevered nights. There are no more prayers being whispered at your bedside. No more leeches, no more locked doors, just quiet. Let your breath fall into a rhythm easy, steady, like footsteps retreating down a long corridor. Picture a candle burning low, its flame soft and steady. The shadows flicker, but they no longer frighten you. They've become gentle now, like curtains swaying in the breeze. The past is behind you. The sickness has passed. Your body, though weary, is still yours. And it is enough. You did not need a miracle. You simply endured. Let that comfort you as sleep pulls at your thoughts, wrapping you in warmth, lifting the weight from your limbs. Inhale once more. Exhale slowly, and let yourself drift far from the coughing rooms, the ash-scented churches, the crowded plague streets, into silence, into rest, into peace.